Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight we step back into a moment when the sky itself became the next great frontier. The space race was not only a contest between nations, it was a sudden turning point in human history. For thousands of years, people looked upward and wondered what waited beyond the clouds. Then, within a single dramatic decade, rockets roared to life and carried humanity beyond Earth for the first time. Satellites began circling the planet. Strange new machines crossed the darkness between worlds. Men and women trained for journeys no human body had ever attempted before. Every launch carried risk. Every success reshaped how people understood their place in the universe. The story is filled with brilliant engineers, daring astronauts, secret programs, political tension, and astonishing discoveries. It is a chapter of history where fear, ambition, and curiosity all pushed humanity toward the stars. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, simply settle in and allow the day to fade. Let your breathing slow and your eyes grow heavy. Together we will travel back to the age when humanity first reached beyond Earth and began the long adventure into space. Let's begin. Sputnik, the first human-made satellite to orbit Earth, turned the night sky into a battlefield of science. When Sputnik crossed overhead in the autumn of 1957, it looked almost absurdly small against the scale of the crisis it created. It was only a polished sphere with antennas, and yet its steady radio pulse sent a shock through governments, classrooms, laboratories, and living rooms. For the first time, an artificial object was circling above every border on Earth. That meant the heavens were no longer distant or untouchable. They had become a place where power could be displayed, measured, and feared. To many people in the United States, that thin electronic beep sounded like a warning that the Soviet Union had leaped into the future first. To many in the Soviet Union, it sounded like proof that their system could achieve the impossible. A new arena had opened over everyone's heads, and from that moment on, science was never just science again. The space race began with a beeping sphere, no bigger than a beach ball. What made that first satellite so astonishing was not its size, but its meaning. It was smaller than many people imagine, and far simpler than later spacecraft, yet it changed history almost instantly. Inside that metal shell were batteries, a radio transmitter, and enough engineering skill to survive launch, vacuum, and the freezing heat swings of orbit. The sound it sent down to Earth was plain and repetitive, but people around the world listened as if they were hearing the future speak for the first time. Newspapers rushed to explain it. Amateur radio operators tried to catch the signal. Children stared upward and realized the sky had become a place humans could enter. The achievement was not only about putting something into orbit, it was about proving that rockets could place machines over the entire planet. That was thrilling, but it was also terrifying, because the same technology hinted at far darker possibilities. A stray dog named Laika became the first living creature to orbit Earth. Laika's journey remains one of the most haunting chapters in early space history, because it joined wonder to tragedy in a single moment. She was a stray dog from the streets of Moscow, chosen in part because Soviet scientists believed tough, adaptable animals would endure extreme conditions better. Before her flight, researchers had sent living creatures upward on shorter missions, but orbit was something entirely different. Nobody truly knew how a body would respond to weightlessness, confinement, vibration, and fear during a full trip around the planet. Her mission was meant to answer those questions, even though the spacecraft had no way to bring her home. Around the world, many people were amazed that life had survived launch into orbit at all. Others were disturbed by the cost. Laika became famous not because she explored by choice, but because she carried human hopes and human ruthlessness together into space and forced the world to confront both. A man named Yuri Gagarin circled Earth and changed human history in one flight. In April of 1961, a young Soviet pilot climbed into a tiny capsule and became the first person to leave Earth and return alive after orbiting the planet. The flight lasted less than 2 hours, yet it transformed the human story. Until that day, space belonged to dreams, telescopes, and fiction. After that day, it belonged to memory. Gagarin's journey proved that a human being could survive the violence of launch, the strange condition of weightlessness, and the fiery plunge back through the atmosphere. Just as important, he returned smiling, calm, and instantly unforgettable. His face appeared across the world as a symbol of courage and modernity. To the Soviet Union, he was a triumph. To the United States, he was a warning that the race had become even more urgent. To ordinary people everywhere, he was something else entirely. He was the first human to see Earth from space and live to tell the tale. Apollo 11 placed human footprints on the moon within 1 decade. That achievement feels almost impossible when you pause and measure the time between beginning and end. In less than 12 years, humanity went from launching its first crewed satellite to landing 2 people on another world. That pace is staggering. It meant solving hundreds of problems that had never existed before, then solving them under pressure, under scrutiny, and often in public. Engineers had to build machines that could survive vacuum, navigate across hundreds of thousands of miles, separate in flight, land on powdery terrain, and return safely. Crews had to train for dangers nobody had ever experienced. Meanwhile, millions watched with a sense that history had become visible in real time. The moon landing was not just one mission reaching success. It was the climax of a period when ambition, fear, money, politics, and human skill were all compressed into a single urgent push. Few eras have moved so quickly from first attempt to immortal achievement. The first moon landing depended on computers weaker than a calculator. One of the strangest things about the lunar landing is that it was guided by computing power that now seems almost laughably small. Modern phones, watches, and even simple household devices far surpass the onboard systems that helped send astronauts to the moon. Yet those early computers were miracles of discipline and design. They were not built to do everything. They were built to do only what mattered most, and to do it reliably while lives depended on every calculation. The Apollo guidance computer had to help steer a spacecraft through space, assist with navigation, and support a landing in an environment where mistakes could not be repaired by a roadside mechanic or a quick update. Astronauts worked with it directly, entering commands by hand, while Mission Control checked and rechecked the plan from Earth. The wonder is not that the machine was limited. The wonder is that human beings understood their goal so clearly they could reach another world with so little. Space food, space suits, and space toilets had to be invented from scratch. Grand history often hides the awkward details, but real exploration depends on them. It is one thing to dream about flying beyond Earth. It is another to ask how a person will eat, breathe, move, sleep, and use the bathroom inside a sealed machine hurtling through emptiness. Early spaceflight forced engineers to confront every ordinary human need in extraordinary circumstances. Food had to stay safe, compact, and manageable in weightlessness. Clothing had to protect the body from vacuum, temperature extremes, and flying dust, while still allowing a person to bend a finger or turn a head. Waste systems had to function in an environment where gravity could no longer do the basic work people take for granted. None of this sounded glamorous, yet all of it was essential. A mission could be ruined by something as mundane as a crumb in the wrong place or a suit joint that resisted movement. Reaching space meant redesigning daily life from the ground up. Two superpowers raced to space because they feared missing the future. The contest was never only about discovery. Beneath the speeches and ceremonies lay a deeper fear that whichever nation mastered space first might shape the coming age in its own image. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were already competing over military power, economic prestige, ideology, and global influence. Space became the most dramatic stage on which to prove that one system could outthink and outbuild the other. Each success carried a message beyond science. It told allies, rivals, and undecided nations who seemed stronger, smarter, and more capable of leading the modern world. That is why launches were followed with such tension. A rocket lifting off was also a claim about education, industry, discipline, and national destiny. Leaders understood that the future would not be judged only by armies or speeches. It would be judged by who could turn imagination into machinery. In that sense, the race was about tomorrow long before it was about the stars. Astronauts and cosmonauts rode rockets built from weapons of war. There is a hard truth at the center of the space race. Many of the machines that carried people upward grew from technology first developed to deliver destruction across continents. The same basic rocket principles that could lift a capsule toward orbit had also been refined through missile programs shaped by fear, rivalry, and war. That gave the age a strange double character. Every launch could feel noble and menacing at once. A towering vehicle on the pad represented exploration, but it also reminded the world that space technology and military power were closely related. Engineers who dreamed of reaching other worlds often worked within systems funded by governments that were thinking about deterrence, dominance, and survival. This did not make the human achievements less extraordinary, but it gave them a darker background. The road to the stars was not built in innocence. It rose out of a century of conflict, and some of its greatest triumphs were carried aloft on that uneasy inheritance. The space race changed classrooms, politics, technology, and dreams across the world. Its influence spread far beyond launch sites and astronaut crews. In the United States, Sputnik helped trigger new urgency around science and mathematics in schools. Governments invested more heavily in research, universities expanded programs, and children grew up hearing that equations and engineering mattered to national survival. In the Soviet Union, achievements in orbit became powerful symbols of modern strength and national pride. Around the wider world, people followed the race as proof that history was speeding up and that human beings had entered a new age. Technology developed for space filtered into communications, materials, electronics, and the way large scientific projects were organized. Just as important was the effect on imagination. Suddenly, a child could look at the moon and think not only of myth or poetry, but of machines, missions, and human footsteps. The race altered what people believed was possible. It made the future feel closer, larger, and far more real than it had before. Werner von Braun helped build rockets for Hitler before building them for NASA. His story is one of the strangest and most troubling in the whole space race because it joins scientific brilliance to one of history's darkest regimes. In wartime Germany, von Braun worked on the V-2 rocket, a weapon designed to strike cities from far beyond the reach of ordinary defenses. It was a terrifying machine, and it was built through a brutal system that used forced labor under horrific conditions. After the war, the United States brought him and other German engineers to America, where his expertise became deeply valuable. There, he helped shape the rockets that would eventually send Americans toward the moon. That creates an uneasy truth at the heart of space history. Some of the greatest achievements in exploration were built with knowledge forged in violence and dictatorship. His life forces us to face a difficult question. Can a machine carry human hope upward when its origins are stained by suffering on the ground? Sergei Korolev led the Soviet space program while his name stayed secret. For years, the most important architect of Soviet space triumphs was invisible to the world. Korolev was the chief designer behind the missions that launched Sputnik, sent Laika into orbit, and carried Yuri Gagarin into the history books, yet newspapers did not celebrate him by name. Soviet secrecy kept him hidden, partly to protect a national asset, and partly to preserve the image of a system that seemed to achieve miracles without individual heroes. That mystery made the early Soviet program feel even more formidable. Behind it stood a man whose own life had been scarred by the state he served. During Stalin's purges, he was arrested, beaten, and sent into the Gulag. He survived, returned to engineering, and then helped build the very program that would stun the world. His career feels almost unbelievable. One of the most important figures in modern history changed the future while remaining, to the public, almost a ghost. The Soviet Union stunned the world by launching the first satellite first. Before Sputnik rose into orbit, many in the West assumed the United States would naturally lead the way into space. America seemed wealthier, technologically confident, and publicly ambitious. That is one reason the Soviet achievement landed with such force. It overturned assumptions in a single night. This was not only a scientific first. It was a moment of psychological upheaval. A rival state, often portrayed as rigid or backward, had reached space before the nation many expected to dominate the age of rockets. The shock echoed through politics, journalism, and ordinary conversation. People did not just ask how the Soviets had done it. They asked what else they might now be capable of. The launch suggested a powerful industrial system, disciplined research, and rocket technology with consequences far beyond astronomy. In one stroke, the Soviet Union seized the initiative in the most dramatic contest of the age and forced the rest of the world to look up with new unease. American officials learned about Sputnik partly by listening to its radio beep. One of the most surreal details of the early space race is that a geopolitical shock arrived as a simple sound. Sputnik did not speak in grand language. It broadcast a repetitive signal that could be picked up by radio operators on the ground, and that plain electronic pulse became one of the most famous noises in 20th century history. Officials, scientists, and enthusiasts listened as it passed overhead, each beep confirming that the satellite was really there, circling beyond reach. It must have felt eerie. The proof of a new age was not hidden in a classified vault. It was arriving through the air itself. That sound made the achievement intimate in a way a newspaper headline never could. You could hear the orbit. You could hear the success. For American leaders, that mattered deeply because it turned abstraction into evidence. The Soviet breakthrough was no rumor, no theory, and no distant claim. It was crossing the sky and announcing itself in real time. Sputnik's signal made many Americans fear they were suddenly behind. The panic was not only about one satellite. It was about what that satellite seemed to reveal. If the Soviet Union could place an object into orbit, then perhaps it had stronger rockets, better training, or greater technological momentum than the United States had admitted to itself. That fear spread quickly because the launch struck at confidence. Many Americans had grown used to thinking of their country as the natural leader in science and industry. Suddenly, that assumption felt vulnerable. Parents worried about education. Politicians worried about national prestige. Military planners worried about missile power. newspapers and broadcasters fed the sense that a gap had opened somewhere high above, and that the nation had been caught looking the wrong way. Whether every fear was accurate mattered less than the feeling itself. Sputnik became a symbol of being overtaken. Its little pulse from orbit seemed to ask a humiliating question. What else had the Soviet Union already achieved while America was still expecting to go first? The first satellites were tiny, but their political shockwaves were enormous. It is easy to picture early spacecraft as grand machines, yet many were compact, stripped down, and astonishingly modest by modern standards. Their physical scale was small, but their symbolic weight was immense. A few instruments, a radio, a shell of metal, and a successful rocket launch were enough to alter diplomacy, strategy, and public emotion across the globe. That is because orbit itself was the real message. Once a nation could place even a small object above Earth, it proved mastery over guidance, propulsion, and timing at a level that implied much more than scientific curiosity. Tiny satellites carried giant implications. They suggested surveillance from above, communication over distance, and missile technology with global reach. They also became trophies in a struggle for prestige. In an age of television and headlines, size mattered less than significance. These machines did not need to be large to feel monumental. Their true dimensions were measured in fear, admiration, and the sudden expansion of human possibility. Explorer 1 discovered a deadly belt of radiation around Earth. America's first successful satellite did more than answer Sputnik with a launch of its own. It revealed that space was not an empty, harmless void waiting politely for human arrival. Explorer 1 carried scientific instruments designed to measure cosmic rays, and the puzzling readings it returned led researchers toward a startling discovery. Earth is wrapped in zones of trapped charged particles, regions of intense radiation that can damage living tissue and electronics alike. These became known as the Van Allen belts, and their discovery changed the practical meaning of space travel almost at once. Beyond the atmosphere, danger was not limited to rockets, heat, or vacuum. Invisible hazards were waiting there too. That made the path forward more complicated and more fascinating. The planet was not simply surrounded by silence. It was enclosed by energetic regions shaped by Earth's magnetic field, beautiful in theory and threatening in reality. Reaching space meant learning that even near home, the cosmos could be hostile. America's first successful satellite carried instruments instead of a passenger. That choice says a great deal about the stage the space race had reached. Before people could be sent safely into orbit, scientists needed answers. They needed to know what conditions existed above the atmosphere, what forces a spacecraft would face, and what hidden dangers might ruin a mission before it truly began. So Explorer 1 carried measuring devices rather than a living traveler, and that decision turned the satellite into a scout for the human future. It was not built to inspire with a face or a heartbeat. It was built to gather knowledge that could protect those who would eventually follow. There is something quietly profound in that. A machine went first, not to claim glory, but to ask questions on our behalf. Its instruments returned data that helped reveal the environment around Earth as a real place with structure and risk. In that sense, America's first satellite was less like a flag and more like a cautious first footstep. The Van Allen belts were found because the space race reached upward. Some discoveries happen because people go looking for them. Others appear because ambition pushes technology into places where nature finally reveals a secret. The radiation belts around Earth belong to that second kind of discovery. No ancient philosopher could have guessed them by staring at the stars, and no ordinary laboratory could have uncovered them from the ground. They became visible only because the drive to compete in space carried instruments beyond the atmosphere. That is one of the most remarkable side effects of the space race. Rivalry did not only produce rockets and headlines, it also exposed hidden features of the planet itself. Earth suddenly seemed stranger than before, wrapped in energetic regions shaped by magnetism and solar activity. The discovery reminds us that the race changed knowledge as much as prestige. Even when nations were trying to outdo one another, they were also expanding humanity's map of reality. Competition opened a path, and science found something waiting there. Early rockets failed so often that launch pads became fields of wreckage. The polished triumphs remembered today can make the era seem smoother than it was. In truth, early rocketry was full of explosions, engine failures, guidance errors, and flaming debris scattered across test sites. Engineers were working at the edge of what materials, fuels, and mathematics could yet support, and the margin for error was painfully small. A valve could stick. A pump could fail. A structure could tear apart under forces no one had fully mastered. Each launch carried the possibility of public embarrassment or private disaster. Yet those failures were not random chaos. They were part of the brutal education that spaceflight demanded. Teams learned from twisted metal and blackened concrete. They studied fragments, traced faults, redesigned parts, and tried again. That cycle gave the space race its intense character. Every successful ascent stood on a foundation of ruined attempts. Before rockets became symbols of confidence, they were very often symbols of how violently nature punishes incomplete understanding. Vanguard's public explosion became one of the space race's first humiliations. In December of 1957, the United States tried to answer Soviet success with a launch that millions were ready to celebrate. Instead, the Vanguard rocket rose only a few feet, lost thrust, dropped back onto the pad, and exploded in a burst of flame and embarrassment. The satellite rolled away from the wreckage and kept transmitting for a short time, which only made the scene feel stranger. It was a disaster made for television, and that mattered enormously. This was not a failure hidden behind fences. It unfolded before cameras, commentators, and a world already wondering whether America had fallen behind. Newspapers mocked it. Rivals laughed at it. Citizens winced at it. Yet the moment became important for another reason. It stripped away comforting illusions. After that, the United States could not treat space as a public relations exercise. It had to become better, faster, more disciplined, and far more serious than before. The Soviet lunar program reached the moon before America ever did. Long before Neil Armstrong stepped onto lunar dust, Soviet probes were already racing across the void toward that pale world. The lunar program carried the early drama of the space race far beyond Earth orbit and turned the moon from a distant symbol into a real destination. These missions were risky, often crude, and sometimes short-lived, but they proved that the Soviet Union could aim not only upward, but outward. That distinction mattered. Reaching orbit showed power. Reaching the moon suggested precision on an entirely different scale. Suddenly, the contest was no longer about circling Earth. It was about crossing space itself. Each attempt expanded what people thought machines could do. Each success made the moon feel less like an unreachable lantern and more like the next arena of rivalry. For audiences around the world, that was astonishing. Humanity had begun to throw its creations across the darkness toward another world, and the Soviet Union got there first. Luna 2 became the first human object to strike the moon. That impact in September of 1959 was not gentle, and it was not meant to be. Luna 2 did not land softly or send back long reports. It slammed into the lunar surface at tremendous speed and proved something blunt but historic. human engineering had crossed the gulf to another celestial body. For the first time, an object made on Earth had touched another world. Even without a graceful landing, that achievement had enormous force. It told scientists that trajectories across this lunar space could be calculated and executed. It told political leaders that the Soviet program remained dangerously formidable. It told ordinary people that the moon was no longer only an object of myth, tides, and distant light. It was now a place that human hardware could reach. There is something almost shocking in that transition. One day, the moon was remote beyond imagination. Then suddenly a machine from Earth had made contact, and the universe felt smaller than before. Luna 3 revealed the moon's far side for the first time. For all of human history, one face of the moon had watched Earth while the other remained hidden. Poets wrote about the moon. Sailors navigated by it. Civilizations built calendars around it. Yet no one had ever seen its far side until a Soviet probe flew around it and sent back ghostly images in 1959. The pictures were blurred and rough by modern standards, but their effect was thrilling. A place known to every human being had suddenly become unfamiliar. The hidden hemisphere was no longer a blank space for fantasy. It was a real landscape with craters, uplands, and patterns nobody on Earth had ever studied before. That moment carried a deep emotional charge because it broke an ancient visual limit. Human eyes had never directly looked there, yet human technology had done so. The mission opened a secret chamber in a familiar object and reminded the world that even the nearest celestial neighbor still held unseen territory. The moon's hidden face looked nothing like people expected. Many assumed the far side would resemble the near side, just with different arrangements of familiar features. Instead, the first images suggested a landscape with far fewer dark maria, those broad plains that shape the patterns many people think they see from Earth. The hidden hemisphere looked more rugged, more heavily cratered, and in some ways more alien than expected. That mattered because it challenged a quiet human habit. We often imagine unseen places by extending what we already know, then nature surprises us. The moon had been hanging over human history since before memory, yet half of it still had the power to overturn assumptions in a single set of photographs. Scientists had new puzzles to solve about its history and geology. The public gained something just as powerful, a renewed sense that space could still astonish. Even our nearest neighbor was not fully known. Familiarity had hidden strangeness, and the space race suddenly pulled back the curtain. Space probes rewrote lunar maps before astronauts ever left Earth orbit. Before people could hope to land safely on the moon, machines had to scout ahead and turn mystery into knowledge. Robotic missions transformed the lunar surface from a distant blur into a charted place with named regions, measured hazards, and growing geological meaning. They photographed craters, traced mountain ranges, and helped estimate what kind of ground a spacecraft might meet. That work was not glamorous in the same way as a human footprint, but it was essential. Exploration often begins with patient seeing. A map can be as revolutionary as a landing when it changes a world from unknown to navigable. These early probes did exactly that. They gave mission planners real terrain instead of guesswork. They gave scientists a richer target for questions about origin and structure. They also changed the way the public imagined the moon. It became less like a smooth silver disk and more like a rugged destination with specific places, dangers, and routes. Knowledge arrived before footsteps. Ham the chimp survived a wild test flight before Americans flew. Ham's mission in January of 1961 was not a calm rehearsal. It was a rough, dramatic test that revealed just how unforgiving early spaceflight could be. Inside his capsule, the young chimpanzee endured violent acceleration. far higher altitudes than many expected, and a chaotic return after the spacecraft overshot its planned path. The capsule splashed down in the ocean and began taking on water before recovery teams reached it. By the end, Ham was alive, stressed, and famous. His survival carried huge meaning because American leaders needed evidence that a living passenger could withstand the forces of launch and brief weightlessness. Engineers needed data. Doctors needed reassurance. The public needed confidence. Ham provided all three, though at a cost paid in fear by a creature who never chose the journey. His flight helped clear the way for Alan Shepard, and it exposed the thin line between a triumphant test and a deadly loss. Enos, the chimp, orbited Earth before John Glenn did. By the time Enos flew in November of 1961, the United States was preparing for the leap from short suborbital hops to full orbital flight. That step required more than courage. It required proof that a living body could endure a longer mission while systems performed as planned around the entire planet. Enos became that proof. His spacecraft completed 2 orbits, though the mission was far from smooth. Equipment problems caused repeated electric shocks during tasks he was trained to perform, and several systems raised concern during the flight. Even so, he kept functioning, and the capsule returned safely enough to strengthen confidence in the Mercury program. His journey became a bridge between uncertainty and commitment. John Glenn's orbital mission followed only a few months later, and it rested partly on what Enos had shown under pressure. There is something sobering in that sequence. Before one national hero made history in public, a small primate endured the unknown in his place. Animals flew into space because nobody knew what launch would do. That uncertainty is easy to forget now because human spaceflight has become part of modern memory. In the beginning, though, almost every stage of ascent was a question mark. Would the crushing acceleration stop the heart? Would weightlessness scramble the inner ear or the mind? Would re-entry stresses overwhelm the body before recovery was possible? Scientists could theorize, but theory only goes so far when no human has ever been there. So animals were sent first, from dogs and monkeys to mice and chimpanzees, not because the missions were simple, but because they were dangerous experiments. Researchers watched breathing, pulse, behavior, and survival with intense interest because each flight offered a first glimpse into a realm biology had never entered. The ethics remain painful and complicated. So does the history. These creatures became involuntary pioneers in a contest that mixed curiosity, caution, and ambition. Their journeys remind us how much ignorance lay beneath the confidence of the age. Yuri Gagarin landed by parachute after ejecting from his capsule. One of the least expected details of the first human orbital mission is that the pilot did not actually come down inside the spacecraft all the way to the ground. Near the end of descent, Gagarin was ejected from the Vostok capsule and came down separately beneath his own parachute. That procedure was built into the design because the landing forces inside the capsule were considered too dangerous for a person to absorb safely. It adds a final twist to an already astonishing mission. The first human to orbit Earth survived launch, weightlessness, re-entry, and then a solitary fall through the sky over the Soviet countryside. For years, this detail was downplayed because international records preferred a pilot to land with the craft. Yet the truth makes the story even more extraordinary. Gagarin did not simply ride a machine around the planet. He returned from space by plunging out of it and trusting silk, timing, and nerve to carry him home. Gagarin's historic spacecraft was too cramped to let him move much. The first human orbital capsule was not a roomy cockpit built for comfort or control. It was a tight, unforgiving sphere designed to do one thing above all else: keep a person alive long enough to circle Earth and return. Gagarin sat strapped into a space so confined that freedom of movement was barely part of the experience. He was less like a pilot roaming a machine and more like a passenger sealed inside a carefully engineered shell. That detail matters because it reveals how early human spaceflight really worked. The triumph did not come from elegant ease. It came from trusting a tiny volume of metal, wiring, air supply, and automatic systems, while the planet rolled beneath him. There is something almost startling about that image. The first man in space did not stride into the cosmos. He endured it inside a chamber so small that history's greatest view arrived with hardly any room to shift your shoulders. Vostok capsules were little more than metal spheres wrapped in hope. Seen from the outside, the early Soviet capsules looked almost blunt in their simplicity. They lacked the sleek fantasy of science fiction and resembled something more practical, a rounded shell built to survive conditions that no human body could endure alone. The genius of that design was not elegance. It was toughness. A sphere spreads stress well, handles pressure cleanly, and offers one of the simplest shapes for surviving the brutal journey back through the atmosphere. Yet behind that logic lay enormous uncertainty. Engineers could calculate, test, and refine, but they were still sending people into a realm where small mistakes could become fatal within seconds. That is why these craft feel so striking in hindsight. They were physically simple compared with later spacecraft, but they carried immense faith inside them. Faith in physics. Faith in workmanship. Faith in procedures. Most of all, faith that a person could be placed inside a sealed ball of machinery and brought home from space alive. John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth amid national anxiety. By the time Glenn prepared for launch in February of 1962, the United States had already watched the Soviet Union claim several of the greatest firsts of the age. That gave his mission a weight far beyond one man and one spacecraft. He was stepping into orbit with a whole country listening for reassurance. Glenn was already admired as a Marine pilot and as one of the Mercury astronauts, but this flight demanded something greater than personal bravery. It demanded composure under national pressure. If he succeeded, America would prove it could finally match a central Soviet achievement. If he failed, a sense of lagging behind could deepen even further. That tension gave the mission its particular drama. Glenn did not merely circle Earth. He carried expectation with him on every orbit. When he flew over continents and oceans, millions followed the journey not only as spectators to exploration, but as witnesses to a test of confidence in the American future. Glenn's mission nearly ended in disaster because of a heat shield scare. Partway through Glenn's flight, Mission Control received data suggesting that the heat shield protecting his capsule during re-entry might have come loose. If that were true, the consequences could be catastrophic. On the way home, returning spacecraft crash into the atmosphere at enormous speed, and the heat generated can reach levels no ordinary structure could survive. The shield was not a minor component. It was the barrier between life and incineration. Officials on the ground faced a grim dilemma. They chose to leave a retro-rocket package strapped in place, hoping it might help hold the shield if the warning was real. Glenn knew something was wrong, though not every detail, and then had to endure re-entry with the possibility of disaster hanging over him. In the end, the shield held. The signal had been misleading. Yet the episode reveals how fragile early spaceflight remained. Even during triumph, one doubtful reading could suddenly turn history into a brush with death. Friendship 7 splashed down with the world holding its breath. Re-entry was only part of the trial. After the fire, the shaking, and the long plunge back through the atmosphere, Glenn still had to come down safely into the Atlantic and wait for recovery forces to reach him. That final phase carried its own drama, because it was the visible closing act of a mission the world had followed orbit by orbit. People knew the flight had gone well enough to inspire hope, but they also knew that early space travel could punish overconfidence at the very end. When Friendship 7 finally splashed down, the relief was immense. Ships and aircraft moved in. Cameras and headlines turned the recovery into a moment of shared exhale. Glenn emerged not only as a successful astronaut, but as proof that America could send a man into orbit and bring him home alive. The landing mattered because it completed the story. Exploration is one thing. Return is another. Only when he was safe did triumph truly settle in. Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space before America sent one. In June of 1963, the Soviet Union claimed another startling, first by sending Valentina Tereshkova into orbit. Her flight was historically immense, not only because she was the first woman to leave Earth, but because it exposed how narrow many assumptions about spaceflight had been. The early astronaut image had often centered on male military test pilots, disciplined figures shaped by air forces and engineering culture. Tereshkova did not fit that pattern. She came from a working-class background, had trained as a parachutist, and entered history through a program that understood the political force of symbolic firsts. Her mission sent a message in several directions at once. It celebrated Soviet progress, challenged Western expectations, and widened the human meaning of the space age. For countless girls and women watching from afar, it also changed the shape of possibility. Space no longer belonged only to one kind of body or biography. It had opened, however unevenly, to someone new. Tereshkova flew alone and endured a mission far harsher than expected. The image of her smiling in uniform can make the journey seem smoother than it truly was. In reality, the mission placed her inside a demanding environment that proved physically draining and psychologically intense. She spent nearly 3 days in orbit, which was an extraordinary duration for that era, especially for someone flying alone without the companionship or shared burden of a crewmate. Reports from the mission later suggested discomfort, nausea, fatigue, and technical concerns that made the experience far more difficult than public celebration implied at the time. That solitude is part of what makes the achievement so striking. She was not only representing a nation or a milestone, she was enduring the strange pressure of space with no one beside her in the capsule. The mission reminds us that firsts often come wrapped in myth, while the lived reality is far more demanding. Glory may shine afterward, but the actual flight can be exhausting, disorienting, and deeply hard-won. Alexei Leonov nearly died during the first spacewalk. When Leonov floated out of his spacecraft in March of 1965, he crossed a threshold as dramatic as the first orbit or the first trip to the moon. For the first time, a human being was not merely riding through space inside a capsule. He was exposed to it outside the vehicle, connected only by a tether and his suit. The sight was magnificent, and the danger was extreme. Spacewalks had never been tested by human experience, only by planning, simulation, and nerve. Once outside, Leonov faced the silence and brightness of open space with Earth below him, and the mission quickly became far more dangerous than the world knew at first. Equipment limits, physical strain, and the harshness of the environment combined to turn a symbolic triumph into a life-threatening struggle. That is what makes the moment so gripping. The first walk in space was not a graceful stroll into a new age. It was a near disaster in full view of history. Leonov's suit swelled so much he could barely re-enter his spacecraft. Vacuum does not behave like air, and the first spacewalk taught that lesson in terrifying fashion. Once Leonov was outside, his suit inflated more than expected in the pressure difference, becoming stiff and difficult to control. His gloves were harder to use. His body movement became limited. Worst of all, when it was time to go back inside, the suit had swollen so much that he could not fit through the airlock the way he was supposed to. Imagine the panic of that moment. Home was inches away, yet physically unreachable. Leonov made a desperate decision. He bled air from the suit to shrink it, even though that increased the danger he faced. Then he forced his way back in, exhausted and overheating. It is one of the most gripping survival moments in the whole space race. A mission planned as a triumph of engineering suddenly depended on one man improvising against the hostile logic of space itself. The first spacewalk proved space itself could fight back. Up to that point, much of the danger in spaceflight seemed tied to machines. Rockets could fail. Capsules could burn. Guidance systems could falter. The first walk outside a spacecraft revealed something deeper. Even when the hardware worked well enough to get a human into position, the environment itself remained an active opponent. Vacuum altered pressure. Sunlight and shadow created brutal temperature extremes. Movement became awkward and exhausting. Orientation could feel strange and unstable. A person outside the vehicle was not simply visiting an empty stage. He was entering a realm that resisted the human body at every level. That realization changed the future of exploration. It meant that survival in orbit would depend not only on bigger rockets or better navigation, but on mastering the direct relationship between a fragile body and an unforgiving environment. The first spacewalk was therefore more than a new achievement. It was a warning. Space was not waiting to welcome anyone. It had to be confronted, learned, and survived. American Gemini missions taught astronauts how to survive and work in orbit. Mercury had shown that a person could go into space and come back. Gemini had to answer a harder question. Could people actually live and function there long enough to attempt something greater? Across 10 crewed missions, NASA turned orbit into a working environment instead of a brief stunt. Astronauts spent longer stretches away from Earth, tested how their bodies handled weightlessness, practiced spacewalks, and learned how even simple tasks became awkward once gravity vanished. Food, fatigue, tools, and patience all became part of the lesson. These flights were the workshop in which American space travel began to mature. The goal was not only survival, though even that could not be taken for granted. The goal was competence. Crews had to learn how to think clearly, solve problems, and carry out demanding procedures in a place that constantly interfered with ordinary movement and judgment. Gemini was where astronauts stopped being passengers and started becoming workers in space. Gemini astronauts learned docking by chasing targets at thousands of miles per hour. Docking sounds almost calm when spoken aloud, but in practice it meant guiding one spacecraft toward another while both were hurtling around Earth at extraordinary speed. The trick was not simply catching up. In orbit, motion behaves in ways that defy everyday instinct. A push in the wrong direction can raise or lower an orbit. Closing the distance requires timing, mathematics, and restraint, not a straight-line pursuit like a car chase. Gemini crews had to master this strange dance because future lunar missions would depend on joining spacecraft accurately and safely. That meant reading instruments, firing thrusters in careful bursts, and approaching targets without drifting into collision or wasting precious fuel. There is something deeply thrilling about the image. Two machines racing around the planet, one inching toward the other in silent precision, while the people inside try to think through physics that no human being evolved to feel. It was orbital pursuit turned into pure skill. A spinning Gemini capsule nearly killed Neil Armstrong in orbit. Long before Armstrong became famous for stepping onto the moon, he faced one of the most frightening emergencies of the Gemini program. During Gemini 8, after a successful docking with an unmanned target vehicle, the joint spacecraft began to roll unexpectedly. At first, the crew suspected the problem lay with the target, so they undocked. That made everything worse. The Gemini capsule began spinning faster and faster as a stuck thruster drove it into a dangerous rotation. Vision blurred. The force built rapidly. If it had continued, the crew could have blacked out and died in orbit. Armstrong responded with remarkable calm. He identified the source of the problem, shut down the correct system, and used the re-entry thrusters to stop the spin, even though doing so forced the mission to end early. The episode reveals a side of space history that fame can soften. One of the most composed figures of the age first proved himself by surviving chaos. Space rendezvous was mastered because the moon demanded orbital precision. The moon landing was never just about launching a giant rocket and pointing it outward. The Apollo plan required spacecraft to separate, meet again, and rejoin with exact timing far from Earth. That meant NASA first had to master rendezvous in Earth orbit, where crews could practice the techniques that would later decide whether lunar travelers lived or died. If the lunar module rose from the moon and failed to meet the command module overhead, there would be no rescue ship waiting nearby. The mission architecture made precision a condition of survival. That is why rendezvous became one of the great hidden achievements of the space race. It transformed orbital mechanics from abstract calculation into practiced human skill. Pilots and controllers learned to think in curves, timing, and relative motion, instead of simple direction. They had to trust numbers that sometimes contradicted instinct. By doing so, they turned empty space into a place where two machines could find each other on purpose. Without docking practice, Apollo could never have reached the lunar surface. It is tempting to imagine the moon landing as a straight journey, one ship leaving Earth and one ship coming home. The real plan was far more intricate. Apollo relied on a command module circling the moon while a separate lander descended to the surface and later rose to meet it again. That meant docking was not an optional flourish. It was the hinge on which the entire mission turned. Every rehearsal in Gemini therefore carried the future of Apollo inside it. Each successful approach, each locked connection, and each hard lesson about fuel use or closing speed made the eventual lunar landing more possible. Without that training, the moon could have been reached only as a one-way trip. This is what makes docking so fascinating. It was not the famous moment on television, yet it was one of the quiet triumphs that made the famous moment real. The path to the moon depended on learning how to meet precisely in motion. The Saturn V remains one of the most powerful machines ever built. Even today, the Saturn V inspires awe because it seems to belong to a category beyond ordinary engineering. Standing taller than a many-story building and loaded with propellant, it was a controlled explosion shaped into a vehicle. At launch, its engines produced a force so immense that the rocket seemed less like a machine switching on and more like a piece of Earth forcing itself upward. Yet brute strength alone was not enough. This giant had to rise in balance, stage cleanly, and hurl astronauts and hardware toward the moon with astonishing accuracy. That blend of violence and precision is what makes it unforgettable. Millions of parts, countless calculations, and years of industrial effort all had to work together in a few terrible, magnificent minutes. The Saturn V did not merely lift payloads. It lifted an entire national promise. When it rose from the pad, it carried not just people, but the concentrated ambition of an era. Apollo's giant rocket shook windows miles away during launch. People who watched Saturn V launches in person often described the experience as something beyond sight, almost beyond hearing. The rocket did not simply make noise. It produced a physical event. The sound rolled across the landscape with such force that it struck the body as much as the ear. Windows rattled far away. Ground vibrations arrived through feet and chest. A bright column of flame stretched beneath the rising vehicle, while the delay between seeing and truly feeling the power added a strange, almost unreal quality to the moment. This mattered because it reminded everyone that the moon missions were not abstractions assembled from diagrams and speeches. They began with raw force on a scale almost impossible to ignore. Before astronauts reached silence in space, they had to ride through one of the loudest and most violent departures humans had ever engineered. The launch made the lunar dream feel material. It was history you could hear, and history you could feel. The command module, service module, and lunar module each had separate jobs. Apollo worked because it was not one spacecraft doing everything badly, but several connected parts, each designed for a different role. The command module was the crew's main home during launch, re-entry, and splashdown. The service module sat behind it and carried propulsion, fuel cells, oxygen, and other essential systems that kept the mission alive in deep space. Then there was the lunar module, a strange separate craft built specifically to descend to the moon and climb back up again. This division of labor was one of Apollo's great strengths. Rather than drag a single bulky vehicle through every stage of the journey, NASA built a system in which each section could do one task well. That choice made the mission more complex, but also more possible. It is a beautiful example of intelligent design under pressure. The moon was reached not by simplicity, but by breaking an impossible journey into distinct problems and solving each with its own machine. The lunar module looked fragile because it was built only for vacuum. To many eyes, the lunar module appears almost absurd, more like a spidery foil-wrapped insect than a proud spaceship. That strange appearance came from the fact that it was never meant to fly through Earth's atmosphere. It did not need streamlining, polished symmetry, or heavy structures to handle wind and aerodynamic stress. It was built to operate only in the airless environment of space and the moon. Once you understand that, its oddness becomes a form of honesty. Every surface, angle, and strut reflects ruthless purpose. Weight had to be cut wherever possible. Materials could be thin in places because they would never face weather or drag. The result looked delicate, but that delicacy was a kind of efficiency. It was a machine stripped of earthly habits. In a way, it was one of the first vehicles that truly looked as though it belonged somewhere other than Earth, precisely because it no longer had to pretend it was an airplane. The moonlander had no room for beauty, only survival. Its appearance tells a quiet truth about real exploration. When engineers are trying to place human beings on another world and bring them home alive, elegance becomes secondary to function with startling speed. The lunar module was cramped, angular, and visually awkward because every design choice had to answer a hard question. Does this save weight? Does this protect the crew? Does this help the craft land, operate, or rise again? That is why the interior was sparse, why windows were where they needed to be rather than where they looked best, and why the whole machine resembled equipment rather than fantasy. Yet there is a strange beauty in that severity. The lander looked the way necessity looks when it has no patience for vanity. It was not meant to charm the eye. It was meant to survive vacuum, dust, uncertainty, and the narrow margin between triumph and death. That makes it beautiful in a deeper and more hard-won sense. Apollo 8 carried humans around the moon before any landing attempt. In December of 1968, Apollo 8 made one of the boldest leaps of the entire space race. No human had ever left low Earth orbit before, yet suddenly 3 astronauts were sent all the way to the moon without a lander and without the safety of a rehearsal close to home. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders became the first people to travel that far from Earth, the first to slip behind the moon, and the first to see our world vanish completely from view. That last detail is easy to miss, but it is astonishing. For a time, every human being alive was on one side of space, and 3 men were alone on the other. The mission was a test of nerve as much as engineering. It proved that NASA could navigate to lunar orbit and back, and it transformed the moon from a distant goal into a place human beings could truly reach. Apollo 8 showed humans their world as a small blue sphere. Before spaceflight, people understood Earth in maps, globes, and imagination. Apollo 8 changed that understanding into lived experience. As the spacecraft traveled toward the moon, its crew saw something no human eyes had ever seen directly before: our planet hanging alone in the blackness of space, bright, finite, and astonishingly small. Oceans, clouds, and land were no longer the whole stage of existence. They were part of the single, fragile world suspended in darkness. That shift was not merely visual. It was emotional, even philosophical. Borders disappeared. Nations vanished from sight. The arguments and rivalries of the age suddenly belonged to one tiny sphere drifting through a vast surrounding silence. For the astronauts, that view was unforgettable. For everyone back on Earth, it became one of the great gifts of the mission. The moon mattered, but the deeper revelation was that going outward had changed how humanity could see home. The Earthrise photograph changed how many people saw our planet. When Bill Anders captured the famous Earthrise image on Apollo 8, he recorded far more than a beautiful scene. He gave the modern world a new symbol for itself. The photograph showed Earth lifting above the stark lunar horizon, luminous and delicate against a black sky, and it arrived at a moment when millions were ready to feel its meaning. Here was home, not as an endless backdrop, but as a single radiant world. The image spread quickly and deeply because it combined science, art, and perspective in one frame. People responded to it not only with admiration, but with recognition. The planet looked precious because it looked limited. It looked shared because it looked whole. That is why the photograph endured. It was not simply proof that astronauts had reached lunar orbit. It was a picture that changed scale in the human mind. Earth no longer felt immeasurable. It felt intimate, singular, and worthy of care. Moon missions helped inspire the modern environmental movement back on Earth. One of the great surprises of the space race is that journeys toward the moon helped many people think more urgently about rivers, forests, air, and life on Earth. Images like Earthrise did not create environmental concern by themselves, but they gave it a powerful new visual language. The planet now appeared as one bright world without visible borders, isolated in darkness and clearly finite. That mattered in the late 1960s, when industrial pollution, ecological damage, and public anxiety about the future were already growing. Space photography gave those concerns a new emotional force. It became easier to speak of Earth as a shared home when people had finally seen it that way. Even cultural memory reflects this shift. The first Earth Day followed soon after Apollo 8, and many later observers connected the two moments. The race to another world had unexpectedly sharpened human attention toward this one. Looking outward had made home seem smaller, rarer, and more vulnerable than before. Apollo 11's landing site was chosen to avoid deadly boulders and slopes. The first lunar landing was never going to be attempted just anywhere. Mission planners needed a place that balanced scientific value with the harsh demands of survival, and survival came first. That meant searching for a region that was relatively smooth, open, and flat by lunar standards, without dangerous slopes, giant rocks, or deep craters that could destroy the lander in its final seconds. The Sea of Tranquility offered that balance. It was broad, accessible, and calm enough in appearance to make the unprecedented attempt seem possible, though even there the surface concealed more trouble than maps could fully show. This choice reveals something important about the first moon landing. It was not a romantic plunge into the unknown. It was a tightly judged gamble, shaped by photographs, measurements, and caution. Humanity's first step onto another world depended not only on courage, but on the patient, almost humble act of finding a place where a fragile machine had some chance to survive. Neil Armstrong had to fly past a dangerous crater field by hand. As Eagle descended toward the moon, the planned landing area did not look safe. Armstrong could see that the spacecraft was carrying them toward a field strewn with boulders near a crater, the kind of terrain that could tip the lander, damage its legs, or end the mission in an instant. In that moment, the landing stopped being a matter of trusting the programmed path. He took semi-manual control and guided the craft forward, searching for a better patch of ground while fuel ticked away. This is one of the most gripping moments in exploration because it compresses so much into so little time. After years of planning, testing, and engineering, the first lunar landing came down in part to a pilot looking out a window and making a hard decision under pressure. The moon did not simply receive Apollo 11. It forced a last-minute act of judgment, and Armstrong's calm response helped turn danger into history. Apollo 11 landed with only seconds of fuel remaining. Few details make the landing feel more immediate than the fuel situation in the final moments. As Eagle hovered and moved forward to avoid unsafe ground, the descent consumed precious propellant. In mission control, the CalAlps grew more tense as the remaining margin narrowed. By the time the spacecraft touched down, the amount left was alarmingly small, often described in terms of only seconds. That detail has become part of the landing's legend because it transforms the event from a clean triumph into something far more human. The moon was reached, but not with effortless control. It was reached at the edge of acceptable risk, with the crew and the controllers fully aware that delay could turn into abort or disaster. That is part of what makes the achievement so electric. The first landing on another world did not arrive with luxury or ease. It arrived with restraint, concentration, and a dwindling reserve that made every heartbeat matter. Buzz Aldrin called out computer alarms while descending toward the moon. During the most critical phase of the landing, the lunar module's computer began throwing alarms, and the cabin suddenly filled with one more layer of uncertainty. Aldrin, acting as the crew member most focused on the guidance data, read out the alarm codes while Armstrong continued flying the descent. Those numbers were not theatrical sound effects. They were urgent questions. Did they signal failure? Did they demand an abort? Could the landing continue? In Houston, guidance experts worked rapidly to interpret what the alarms meant, and the answer turned out to be one of the great close calls in the mission. The computer was overloaded, but it was still doing the most important jobs. That allowed the descent to continue. The moment is fascinating because it shows how fragile the path to history can be. While the world remembers the calm words after touchdown, there was also this earlier scene, a tense stream of codes and judgment hanging over the first attempt to land on the moon. Margaret Hamilton's software helped save the moon landing from overload. The lunar landing was not saved only by pilots and controllers in the moment. It was also protected by design choices made years earlier in software. Margaret Hamilton led the team at the MIT Instrumentation Laboratory responsible for the Apollo flight software, and one of the strengths of that work was its ability to prioritize essential tasks when the computer became overloaded. During the Apollo 11 descent, the machine was being asked to do more than it comfortably should because of how radar data interacted with the system. Instead of collapsing into useless confusion, the software discarded lower priority work and kept the crucial guidance functions alive. That decision, built into the code long before launch day, became one of the quiet foundations of success. It is a wonderful reminder that history is often rescued by foresight. The landing was not saved by luck alone. It was saved because someone had imagined failure in advance and taught the machine how to keep thinking when pressure arrived. The Apollo guidance computer squeezed brilliance into astonishingly little memory. By modern standards, the Apollo guidance computer seems almost impossibly limited, yet it helped navigate one of the greatest journeys in human history. Its memory and processing power were tiny compared with even the simplest modern devices, but that comparison can hide the real wonder. The machine did not need abundance. It needed discipline. Engineers had to decide exactly what mattered, exactly how to write it, and exactly how to make it dependable. The result was a computer compact enough to fly, advanced enough to guide spacecraft, and robust enough to support lunar missions under extraordinary pressure. It also pushed forward the use of integrated circuits, helping mark a larger turning point in electronics. What makes it so compelling is not that it was primitive. It is that human beings accomplished so much with so little. Reaching the moon did not begin with unlimited computing. It began with elegant constraints, careful priorities, and the ability to make small machines do remarkable things. Apollo astronauts carried slide rules, checklists, and nerves of steel. The moon missions were not guided by confidence alone. They depended on disciplined habits, physical tools, and constant attention to detail. Inside the spacecraft, astronauts worked through printed checklists line by line because memory was never enough for a task this unforgiving. They used slide rules for quick calculations and carried pages of procedures that had been tested, revised, and memorized until they became a second language. This is one of the most revealing parts of Apollo. The people going to the moon were not behaving like reckless adventurers chasing glory. They were careful operators inside a system where one missed switch or one wrong reading could carry fatal consequences. Yet no checklist could remove fear entirely. The crews still had to trust their training while sitting atop fire, crossing open space, and descending toward a place where no rescue was possible. The hardware was remarkable, but the steady human composure inside it was remarkable too. Mission control depended on thousands of people nobody watching could see. Television turned astronauts into the public faces of the space race, but the moon missions rested on an enormous hidden workforce spread across consoles, back rooms, factories, laboratories, tracking stations, and ships around the world. In Houston, rows of specialists watched guidance, propulsion, communications, electrical systems, life support, and countless other streams of data. Behind them stood still more experts, ready to advise when something looked wrong or uncertain. Far beyond Texas, engineers and technicians kept antennas aligned, computers running, weather tracked, and recovery plans ready. This made Apollo feel almost like a cathedral of coordination. A few people sat inside the spacecraft, but thousands were helping them breathe, navigate, speak, and survive. The famous calm voices on the flight loop were only the surface of that effort. Every mission was a collective act, disguised as a small, crude journey. The moon was reached by a visible handful, but only because an invisible multitude carried them there. Seamstresses helped build spacesuits precise enough for the moon. One of the loveliest surprises in Apollo history is that some of the most advanced equipment of the age depended on skills often dismissed as ordinary domestic craft. The spacesuits worn on the moon were assembled in part by expert seamstresses whose hands were steady enough to work with extraordinary precision, through layers of specialized fabric, insulation, and pressure materials. A single crooked seam or tiny flaw could threaten movement, durability, or life itself. These were not costumes. They were protective systems that had to bend with the body, hold pressure, resist abrasion, and operate in a place with no air and no mercy. The work demanded patience, touch, and exactness on a level machines alone could not yet guarantee. That detail changes the feel of the Moon program in the best way. It reminds us that the road to another world was not built only by rocket engineers and famous pilots. It was also stitched together by remarkable human hands. Moon suits were wearable spacecraft stitched by hand. Calling them clothing barely captures the truth. A lunar suit had to do the work of a tiny personal spacecraft. It supplied pressure around the body, helped regulate temperature, carried life support connections, shielded against dust and sunlight, and still allowed enough movement for walking, bending, sampling, and climbing a ladder. That impossible balance is what makes the design so fascinating. Too stiff, and the astronaut could scarcely move. Too weak, and the suit could fail in a lethal environment. Too heavy, and every task became punishing. Yet these suits were built layer by layer with immense care, using materials and handwork refined through testing, trial, and painful adjustment. On the Moon, the astronaut did not merely step outside. He stepped into vacuum protected by a human-made skin of fabric, joints, seals, and engineering discipline. The suit was a private island of Earth carried on the body, and without it, the Moon would have remained forever untouchable. Lunar dust clung to everything and smelled strangely like burnt gunpowder. Moon dust turned out to be far more troublesome than many expected. It was not soft like garden soil or beach sand. It was jagged, dry, and clingy, made of tiny sharp particles that had not been grounded by wind or water because the Moon has neither. Once astronauts began moving across the surface, the dust stuck to boots, gloves, tools, suit joints, and cabin surfaces, following them everywhere like a stubborn grey ghost. Back inside the lunar module, some crew members described its smell as similar to burnt gunpowder after the particles were tracked in. That odd detail makes the Moon feel suddenly vivid and real. It was not just a silent landscape seen through glass. It had texture, nuisance, and even a memorable scent once brought into human space. The dust also scratched surfaces and irritated concern about equipment wear. Another world had announced itself not with grandeur alone, but with grit that refused to be ignored. Walking on the Moon was exhausting because every movement worked differently. From Earth, the astronauts sometimes look almost playful as they bound across the surface. But the reality was much harder on the body. Lower gravity changed balance, timing, and effort in ways that no training on Earth could fully reproduce. The suits were pressurized and resistant, so even basic motions demanded force. Bending, turning, kneeling, collecting samples, or climbing into position could feel awkward and draining. Every task had to be relearned inside a bulky shell while carrying tools and life support, in a place where falling might not hurt the same way, but getting back up could be a clumsy struggle. This is part of what makes the lunar expeditions so impressive. The astronauts were not strolling across a dreamscape with effortless grace. They were working hard in an environment that constantly disrupted their instincts. Another world does not simply offer new scenery. It rewrites the body's conversation with movement, and that conversation can be exhausting. The flag on the Moon looked like it waved, but never did. That famous image has fooled many eyes because the flag appears to ripple as though stirred by a breeze, even though the Moon has no air. The explanation is wonderfully physical rather than mysterious. The flag was held out by a horizontal support rod, so it would not simply droop downward, and the fabric kept creases from being tightly folded during the journey. When astronauts planted it and adjusted the pole, the cloth moved and then held its wrinkled shape because there was no atmosphere to smooth it out. The illusion is powerful because the eye expects familiar behavior. We see a flag and assume wind. On the moon, the familiar object had entered an unfamiliar world and behaved by different rules. That small visual puzzle captures something essential about space exploration. It forces everyday expectations into a new environment where common sense must be rebuilt. Even a flag becomes a lesson in physics once it stands on another world. Astronauts left mirrors on the moon that still reflect lasers today. Among the objects left behind on the lunar surface were special mirror arrays called retroreflectors, and their purpose was beautifully simple. They send incoming light back toward its source. For decades, scientists on Earth have aimed laser pulses at these mirrors and measured the return time with extraordinary precision. That allows researchers to track the distance to the moon down to astonishing accuracy and to study subtle details of lunar motion and Earth-Moon dynamics over time. This is one of the most elegant legacies of Apollo because it turned a brief human visit into a long scientific conversation across space. A beam leaves Earth, touches hardware placed by astronauts long ago, and comes home carrying information. There is something moving in that. Human beings walked on the moon for only a handful of missions, yet part of that contact continues in flashes of light. The exploration did not end with footprints. It remained active in measurement, patience, and return. Moon rocks revealed the Earth and Moon share a violent origin story. When Apollo samples came back to Earth, they were not merely souvenirs from a triumphant mission. They were clues to a deep planetary past. Scientists studied their composition, age, and isotopic patterns, and over time the evidence suggested that the Moon and Earth are linked far more intimately than simple capture or separate formation would explain. The rocks hinted at a shared beginning rooted in violence, heat, and collision in the early solar system. That realization changed the Moon from a companion object into part of Earth's own history. The pale body in our sky was not just nearby. It was family, born from the same ancient catastrophe. This is one of the grandest rewards of the space race. A political contest pushed humans to another world, and that journey returned with evidence that reshaped our sense of origin. The Moon was no longer only a destination. It became a witness to the earliest, most dramatic chapter of Earth's story. The Moon may have formed from a colossal impact with early Earth. The leading idea to explain the Moon's birth is both violent and strangely poetic. In the young solar system, when worlds were still forming and collisions were common, a Mars-sized body may have slammed into the early Earth. The impact would have been almost beyond imagination, releasing immense heat and hurling vast quantities of material into space. Over time, that debris could have gathered together and formed the Moon. This theory helps explain why lunar material resembles Earth in some ways while still showing important differences, and why the Moon seems unusually large compared with the planet it orbits. What makes the idea so captivating is its scale. Our nearest celestial neighbor may be the surviving child of a world-shattering collision, a lasting monument to chaos at the beginning of planetary history. The quiet moon in our sky may therefore be the cooled remains of one of the most catastrophic events Earth ever experienced, long before life, oceans, or memory. Apollo 12 landed so precisely it reached an earlier robot probe. The second moon landing did something wonderfully audacious. It did not merely touch down somewhere on the vast lunar surface. It aimed for a specific place near Surveyor 3, an unmanned American probe that had landed there years earlier. That demanded a level of accuracy far beyond simply proving that a landing could be done at all. Pete Conrad and Alan Bean came down in the ocean of storms and then walked over to the old spacecraft, which was sitting where engineers had hoped it would be. Imagine the feeling of that moment. Human beings were standing beside a machine sent ahead in an earlier age of uncertainty, now quiet and dust-coated under the black sky. The encounter linked two chapters of exploration in one scene. A robot had gone first to test the unknown. Then, astronauts followed and met it there. The moon was no longer just reachable. It had become a place where precision, planning, and return were possible. Pete Conrad proved a moon landing could be accurate, not just possible. Apollo 11 had shown that human beings could survive the descent and step onto the lunar surface. Apollo 12 added something just as important for the future. It showed that crews could aim with confidence and arrive close to a chosen target, rather than accepting whatever safe patch happened to appear below. That changed the practical meaning of lunar exploration. Once landing became accurate, the moon stopped being merely a symbol of conquest and became a place scientists could truly work with intention. Specific sites could now matter. Particular rock formations, craters, and earlier machines could be reached on purpose. Conrad's calm, skillful descent helped make that transition real. The achievement did not come wrapped in the same worldwide astonishment as the first landing, but it quietly expanded what the entire program could do. Exploration becomes deeper when you can choose where to go. In that sense, precision opened a new phase of lunar history just after possibility had been proven. Apollo 13 turned a near catastrophe into the most famous rescue in space. Few missions reveal human ingenuity under pressure more powerfully than Apollo 13. It began as another planned journey to the moon and became, within moments, a desperate fight to get 3 astronauts home alive. The phrase that often survives in memory is calm and restrained, yet behind it lay a terrifying reality. A spacecraft deep in space had been crippled, vital systems were failing, and the mission objective vanished almost instantly. What followed was not a single heroic act, but a chain of problem-solving that linked astronauts, flight controllers, engineers, and support teams in one long act of improvised survival. Every hour demanded fresh judgment. Every resource had to be stretched. Every mistake threatened to narrow the path home. That is why the story endures so strongly. It was not a triumph over the moon. It was a triumph over unfolding disaster, where intelligence, discipline, and cooperation rescued a mission that had suddenly become a lifeboat. An oxygen tank explosion forced Apollo 13 to abandon its landing. The crisis began with a routine-sounding request from Mission Control, a command to stir the oxygen tanks. Instead of a normal response, the spacecraft shuddered with a violent bang. One of the service module's oxygen tanks had exploded, damaging systems and robbing the crew of the supplies and power they needed for a lunar landing. In an instant, the mission changed character. The moon was no longer the destination. Survival was. Electrical power had to be conserved. Water had to be rationed. The command module, built for re-entry, could no longer remain the main living space for the outward journey. The crew had to retreat into the lunar module and use it as an emergency shelter. That reversal gives the story much of its force. The very craft designed for landing on the moon became the thing that kept the astronauts alive after the landing dream disappeared. Exploration gave way to endurance in the space of a single blast. Engineers on Earth saved Apollo 13 with improvisation and mathematics. One of the most beautiful parts of the Apollo 13 story is that the rescue was built as much from thinking as from hardware. On the ground, engineers and controllers had to solve problems they had never expected to face in exactly that form. They recalculated trajectories, power budgets, life support demands, and re-entry conditions with relentless care. They also tackled smaller problems that suddenly mattered enormously, including how to adapt filters using only the limited materials already on board. This was not glamorous work in the cinematic sense. It was detailed, tense, and exacting. Yet it carried immense drama, because every number represented breath, warmth, electricity, or the angle at which a spacecraft might survive its return. The rescue depended on the ability to turn abstract reasoning into physical survival across 250,000 miles. That is what makes it so compelling. Far from the astronauts, people with pencils, procedures, and sharp minds became an essential part of bringing them home. Apollo 14 golfers and scientists both left their mark on the moon. This mission has a special charm because it carried two very different faces of human curiosity at once. On one hand, Apollo 14 was a serious scientific expedition. Alan Shepard and Edgar Mitchell collected samples, deployed experiments, and explored a landscape chosen to deepen understanding of lunar history. On the other hand, the mission also became famous for one of the most playful moments in spaceflight, when Shepard used a makeshift club to hit golf balls across the moon. Those two sides belong together more than they first appear to. Exploration is rarely only solemn. It also carries delight, surprise, and flashes of personality that remind us human beings are present inside the achievement. Apollo 14, therefore, feels unusually rounded. It was a mission of measurement and mischief, discipline and humor. On a world without air, under a black sky, astronauts managed to leave behind both data for science and a brief gesture of unmistakably human play. Alan Shepard hit golf balls across the moon in low gravity. The image is unforgettable because it feels so improbable. After all the training, machinery, and tension required to reach the lunar surface, one of the astronauts paused and took a few swings with a modified tool to send golf balls arcing through the lower gravity. Shepard joked about the distances, and the moment instantly entered popular memory. Yet what makes it endure is not only the novelty. It captures the strange intimacy of lunar exploration. The moon had been a distant object of awe for all of human history, and now a person was standing there doing something almost ordinary, if still wonderfully absurd. The action also revealed something about the environment itself. In weaker gravity, the balls could travel farther than they would on Earth, though the stiff suit made a proper swing nearly impossible. Science and spectacle met in a single instant. Another world briefly became a playground, and that made it feel startlingly real. Apollo 15 carried the first lunar rover and expanded moon exploration. With Apollo 15, the scale of lunar exploration changed again. Until then, astronauts had been limited mostly to the distance they could cover on foot, which constrained how much terrain they could examine before time, effort, and life support pushed them back toward the lander. The arrival of the lunar rover transformed that equation. Suddenly, crews could travel farther, reach more varied sites, and bring back a richer scientific harvest from each mission. This did not make the moon easy. It made it broader. Mountains, rills, and distant features that once lay beyond practical reach became part of the day's work. The mission also marked a shift in emphasis toward deeper field exploration, almost like the difference between standing at the edge of a landscape and finally being able to move through it. The moon became larger because human mobility on its surface increased. A new machine had given exploration range, and range gave the lunar world greater complexity. The lunar rover let astronauts drive across a world without air. There is something wonderfully strange about the lunar rover because it looks at once familiar and impossible. It had wheels, seats, controls, and suspension like a vehicle from Earth, yet it operated in a place with no atmosphere, brutal temperature swings, and powdery ground under a sky that never turned blue. Folded for the journey and then deployed on the surface, it allowed astronauts to move with a freedom previous crews had never known. They could carry more tools, collect more samples, and study places too distant for a manageable walk in a pressurized suit. Watching it bounce across the moon is one of the great visual pleasures of Apollo. The rover makes the alien seem briefly navigable. A human-built machine rolls over another world, leaving tracks in dust that may last for ages. It is transport at the edge of reality, a car of sorts moving across silence where no engine sound can travel. Apollo 17 was the last time humans walked on the moon. That fact gives the mission a haunting weight. In December of 1972, Gene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt carried out humanity's most recent footsteps on the lunar surface, and no one has returned since. At the time, they could not know how long that absence would last, yet the mission already felt like a closing chapter. Apollo 17 was ambitious and scientifically rich, but it also unfolded under the shadow of an ending. Budgets had tightened, political urgency had faded, and the fever that had driven the race was cooling. So the last explorers on the moon worked in a moment suspended between triumph and farewell. Their tracks, their equipment, and their departure became part of a long silence that still continues. That is what makes the mission so affecting. The age that had moved from first satellite to lunar footsteps in little more than a decade ended with a final ascent, leaving another world waiting, untouched by humans ever since. Harrison Schmitt became the first trained geologist to explore the moon. Most Apollo astronauts were military pilots, chosen because the path to the moon demanded technical discipline, calm nerves, and supreme skill under pressure. Harrison Schmitt brought something different. He was a scientist first, a geologist whose training was rooted in rocks, landscapes, and the stories hidden inside them. When he stepped onto the moon during Apollo 17, lunar exploration changed in a subtle but important way. For the first time, a person with deep field expertise was reading the ground not only as terrain to survive, but as evidence to interpret. That meant sharper choices about where to look, what to collect, and which details might matter later in the laboratory. His presence showed how quickly the moon had changed from a destination of conquest into a place of serious scientific work. Humanity had gone from merely reaching another world to sending a specialist there, someone prepared not just to stand on it, but to understand it. The final Apollo crew left traces of science, not conquest alone. By the time Apollo 17 arrived, the mood of lunar exploration had matured. The first landing had carried the electric force of achievement itself. The last mission carried something quieter and, in its own way, more lasting. The crew deployed experiments, gathered carefully chosen samples, documented the landscape, and treated the moon less like a finish line than a field site. That shift matters because it reveals what exploration becomes after the first astonishment fades. Flags and famous words may open the door, but science is what keeps the journey meaningful after applause dies away. The final crew did not only prove that people could return to the moon, they deepened the knowledge humans brought back from it. Their work added to the long record of instruments, measurements, and geological clues that still shape lunar understanding today. In that sense, the last footsteps were not merely ceremonial. They were part of a lasting conversation between humans and another world. The Soviet Union never sent cosmonauts to the moon despite years of effort. For a nation that achieved so many dramatic firsts in space, this remains one of the most striking absences in the whole story. The Soviet Union launched the first satellite, sent the first living creature into orbit, and carried the first human into space. Yet it never completed the final leap to place a cosmonaut on the lunar surface. That failure was not caused by lack of ambition. Soviet engineers, planners, and leaders pursued the goal for years, but their effort was hampered by divided programs, intense secrecy, political pressure, and technical problems that proved harder to overcome than DI. Public propaganda could admit. The moon therefore became the great unclaimed prize of Soviet space history. It stood just beyond reach, visible to the world and heavy with meaning. That unfinished effort adds real drama to the space race because it reminds us that success was never inevitable. One superpower touched the moon. The other came heartbreakingly close and never made it. The giant Soviet N-1 rocket failed in spectacular secret explosions. The N-1 was the Soviet answer to the Saturn V, a colossal lunar rocket designed to send cosmonauts toward the moon. On paper, it promised power, prestige, and a chance to keep pace with Apollo. In reality, it became one of the great tragedies of the space race. The rocket was extraordinarily complex, especially in its clustered first-stage engines, and that complexity turned early launches into disasters. Some failed almost immediately. Others rose only briefly before catastrophe overtook them. Yet unlike American launches, these failures happened behind the curtain of Soviet secrecy. The wider world did not watch them unfold in real time. That hidden quality gives the story a strange character. An enormous machine meant to rival the greatest rocket of the age kept tearing itself apart in silence, known only to those inside the system and concealed from the global audience that would have understood its meaning at once. It was ambition on a gigantic scale, broken in private. One Soviet rocket blast destroyed a launch site in a single fireball. Among the most dramatic moments in the hidden Soviet lunar struggle was the failure of an N-1 launch in 1969, when the rocket crashed back near the pad and exploded with terrifying force. The blast was so immense that it devastated the launch complex, tearing through equipment and leaving a scene of destruction that looked more like war than exploration. It was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history, and yet most of the world knew nothing about it at the time. That contrast makes the event almost surreal. A disaster of extraordinary scale had taken place in the race for the moon, and it vanished behind secrecy, rather than entering public memory at once. The explosion did not simply ruin one launch. It crippled momentum, damaged facilities, and deepened the sense that Soviet lunar hopes were slipping away. Sometimes history turns on a fireball no one is allowed to see, even when its consequences are immense. Soviet lunar setbacks stayed hidden, while American launches unfolded live on television. This difference in visibility shaped the emotional texture of the space race as much as the rockets themselves. In the United States, launches became public theater. Successes and failures alike unfolded before cameras, commentators, and anxious viewers. People watched flames, countdowns, and splashdowns almost as a shared national ritual. In the Soviet Union, things worked differently. Triumphs were announced with grandeur, but failures were often concealed, delayed, or never admitted at all. That secrecy protected prestige in the short term, yet it also created a distorted picture of the contest. The world saw the Soviet program mainly at its strongest, and the American program in all its messier public reality. As a result, perceptions of momentum could swing strangely. A hidden failure leaves no public scar in the moment, but it can still weaken a program from within. Television gave the American effort vulnerability, but it also gave it honesty. The Soviet effort kept its wounds off screen. Secrecy protected Soviet prestige, but also hid painful engineering failures. At first glance, secrecy seems like an advantage in a high-stakes technological rivalry. If the public never sees the explosion, the embarrassment appears to vanish. If rival nations do not hear the internal arguments, the image of confidence remains intact. Yet that protection came with a cost. Hidden failure is harder to process in the open, harder to debate, and sometimes harder to learn from across a broad engineering culture. The Soviet system could announce victory with great force, but it could not easily build the same public narrative of visible trial, correction, and recovery that the American program did. Pain stayed buried. So did warning signs. The result was a lunar effort that often looked stronger from the outside than it felt on the inside. This is one of the deeper paradoxes of the space race. Concealment can preserve reputation for a while, but it can also trap a program inside its own silence, where problems deepen without the cleansing shock of exposure. The space race was fueled by propaganda as much as physics. Rockets obeyed mathematics, but the reason they mattered so intensely lay in story, image, and political meaning. Every launch was interpreted through ideology. A satellite was not only metal in orbit. It was proof, or claimed proof, that one national system was superior. A human in space was not only a person surviving weightlessness. He or she became a symbol of modernity, discipline, courage, and future destiny. That is why speeches, posters, headlines, parades, and carefully staged announcements were woven so tightly into the history. Both superpowers wanted more than technical success. They wanted narrative power. They wanted allies, rivals, and undecided nations to look upward and see evidence that their way of organizing society led more naturally to the future. This does not make the achievements false. It makes them doubled. Every mission had a physical reality and a political performance layered on top of it. The sky became a laboratory, and just as much, a stage. Each launch was a scientific test and a political performance. A rocket rising from the pad carried instruments, engines, fuel, and human hopes, but it also carried messages aimed at audiences far beyond the mission team. Scientists wanted data. Engineers wanted validation. Politicians wanted proof of strength. Citizens wanted reassurance or pride. Rivals wanted clues about capability. That mix gave launches a special intensity unlike almost any other technological event. A single ascent could be read in several ways at once. It might test a guidance system, rehearse a docking technique, or send back new measurements from space. Yet it could also influence elections, alliances, school funding, military anxiety, and the mood of millions watching D. At home, this is why countdowns felt so charged. They were not only moments before a machine switched on. They were moments before a nation made a statement about itself. In the space race, physics determined whether the rocket flew. Politics helped determine what that flight meant once the world had seen it. School children practiced duck and cover while rockets reached for the stars. That contrast captures the emotional strangeness of the age better than almost anything else. The same era that thrilled children with astronauts, satellites, and moon landings also trained them to fear nuclear war. In classrooms, many practiced drills meant to prepare them for atomic attack, hiding under desks in rituals that mixed instruction with dread. Then they went home and saw rockets celebrated as symbols of courage, progress, and national greatness. The connection between those two experiences was not accidental. The technologies overlapped. The political tensions were the same. The sky held promise and menace at once. That dual feeling gave the space race much of its strange power. It was a dream lit from below by fear. People looked upward in wonder, but they also understood that the same mastery of rockets could carry warheads across continents. The age reached toward the stars with one hand while keeping the other braced against catastrophe. Few periods in history have felt so divided. Space victories often mattered because missile technology mattered even more. For all the wonder of the space race, governments cared so deeply because rockets were never only about exploration. A nation that could hurl a satellite into orbit had also demonstrated frightening skill in long-range missile technology. That made each space success echo far beyond science. It suggested power, reach, and the ability to deliver weapons across enormous distances. In the Cold War, that possibility gave every launch an undertone of dread. A cheering crowd might see progress, but military planners saw implications for defense and vulnerability. This is one reason the race became so intense. Space firsts were public, dramatic, and easy to celebrate. Yet their deeper meaning often lay in what they implied about war. The stars provided the spectacle, but missiles shaped the urgency. That uneasy link gave the age its strange emotional charge. Humanity seemed to be advancing toward the future, yet much of the momentum came from fear of what rivals might do with the same machines. Intercontinental missiles and lunar rockets shared the same terrifying ancestry. The road to the moon did not begin in a clean laboratory devoted only to peaceful discovery. It grew from the same family tree as the ballistic missiles that haunted the Cold War imagination. Both kinds of rockets relied on similar underlying principles of propulsion, guidance, staging, and control. One path led toward other worlds. The other pointed toward cities. That connection gives the space race much of its unsettling depth. The giant boosters that later carried astronauts upward were descendants of machines first pursued for military advantage, and many of the engineers who advanced rocketry had learned their craft in wartime or under the PRAF. Shadow of conflict. This does not diminish the grandeur of lunar exploration, but it changes its texture. The dream of reaching space was bound tightly to the nightmare of long-range destruction. The same century that imagined human footprints on the moon also imagined fire falling from the sky. Both visions rose from shared technological roots. President Kennedy accelerated the moon race with one daring public promise. In 1961, John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and set a goal that sounded almost reckless in its scale. He declared that the United States should commit itself to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the decade was out. It was an extraordinary political gamble because the nation did not yet possess the machinery, experience, or confidence to make that promise feel secure. That is exactly why it mattered. Great programs sometimes begin not when success is visible, but when a leader chooses to make hesitation impossible. Kennedy's challenge gave NASA a deadline, a direction, and a level of national focus unlike anything it had known before. The moon was no longer a vague aspiration. It became a public test of resolve. Once the promise had been spoken aloud, millions of people understood the race differently. History had been given a clock, and the countdown had begun. Kennedy chose the moon partly because America was behind elsewhere. By the early 1960s, the Soviet Union had already seized several of the most dramatic firsts in space. It had launched Sputnik, sent the first living creature into orbit, and carried the first human beyond Earth. Catching up point for point was difficult because the Soviet lead in those categories was already part of history. Kennedy and his advisors needed a goal that would reset the contest, something large enough that earlier setbacks would matter less once the new challenge took hold. The moon offered exactly that. It was so difficult, so visible, and so far beyond current achievement that neither side had yet won it. In that sense, choosing the moon was a strategic act of imagination. Rather than chasing old victories, the United States leaped toward the biggest remaining prize. The decision transformed weakness into momentum. America may have been behind in the opening chapters, but it selected an ending dramatic enough to rewrite the story. The moon became the goal because it was dramatic, difficult, and visible. Not every space objective could capture the world in the same way. A better laboratory result or a more advanced satellite might matter scientifically, but the Moon had something rarer. It was immediately understandable. People everywhere could look up and see the target with their own eyes. That visibility gave the challenge unmatched symbolic power. It was also difficult enough to demand nearly every kind of progress at once, in rocketry, navigation, computing, life support, training, and industrial organization. A nation that could reach the Moon could claim mastery on a scale no smaller mission could equal. The goal therefore made sense politically as well as technically. It was grand, public, and unmistakable. Nobody needed an engineering degree to grasp the meaning of success. That helped turn the lunar effort into a cultural event rather than a purely scientific one. The Moon was chosen not only because it was there, but because everyone knew exactly where there was. NASA expanded with astonishing speed once the Lunar Challenge was announced. After the Moon goal was set, NASA changed from a young agency into a vast national enterprise with remarkable speed. New facilities rose, workforces swelled, contractors multiplied, and universities became more tightly linked to the effort. Entire regions of the United States felt the effect as money, talent, and urgency flowed into the space program. Engineers, mathematicians, machinists, technicians, administrators, and factory workers all became part of a machine much larger than the rockets themselves. The scale of coordination is one of the most impressive features of the era. This was not a small elite project carried by a few brilliant minds. It was a huge, organized expansion of national capacity under the pressure of a public deadline. Such growth could not happen without mistakes, strain, and waste in places, yet the overall transformation remains extraordinary. In only a few years, NASA became capable of attempting one of the most complex feats in human history, and that speed still feels astonishing. The space race poured huge sums into science education and engineering. One of the race's most lasting effects was not launched from a pad at all. It unfolded in classrooms, universities, scholarships, laboratories, and training programs. As competition with the Soviet Union intensified, governments and institutions treated scientific education as a matter of national survival as much as personal advancement. In the United States especially, concern about technological lag helped drive investment in mathematics, physics, engineering, and research. Students were encouraged to see technical knowledge not as a narrow specialty, but as part of the nation's future. Textbooks changed, programs expanded. Young people who might never become astronauts still found themselves drawn into the larger movement through study and opportunity. This mattered because the space race was never only about a handful of missions. It was also about building the human infrastructure to sustain ambition over time. Rockets may have captured attention, but behind them stood a quieter revolution in learning, expertise, and the value placed on scientific skill. Integrated circuits grew partly because spacecraft demanded smaller, lighter computers. Spacecraft imposed ruthless limits. Every extra pound cost performance. Every bulky component fought against the need for compact, reliable design. That pressure helped encourage the adoption of integrated circuits, those tiny electronic components that could do more work in less space than earlier systems built from many separate parts. Apollo in particular became an important early customer for this emerging technology, not because the space program invented modern microelectronics by itself, but because it had a powerful reason to demand d'écart, dependable miniaturization. That demand mattered. When advanced systems are purchased, tested, and trusted at scale, industries mature faster. The result is one of the most fascinating patterns in space race history. A drive aimed at the Moon helped push forward technologies that later flowed into ordinary life on Earth. What began as a need inside cramped spacecraft contributed to a broader transformation in electronics. The future became smaller, lighter, and more powerful, partly because space exploration required it to be. Weather satellites, communication satellites, and navigation all grew from early space rivalry. The rivalry of the space race produced much more than heroic photographs and famous missions. It also helped build the orbital infrastructure that now shapes ordinary life in ways many people scarcely notice. Early satellite work opened paths toward better weather forecasting, faster long-distance communication, and systems of positioning that would eventually transform travel, trade, and daily convenience. This is one of the most remarkable afterlives of the era. A competition born from tension and prestige ended up seeding tools that quietly serve farms, ships, aircraft, emergency services, businesses, and families around the world. Storms can be tracked from above. Messages can cross oceans almost instantly. Locations can be fixed with astonishing precision. None of that sprang from a single launch, yet the early rivalry created momentum, funding, and technical capacity that made such systems grow more quickly. The space race reached upward in drama, but much of its legacy settled back down into everyday life. Space medicine advanced because nobody knew how bodies would handle orbit. Before people began spending real time in space, many basic questions about the human body remained unanswered. Would weightlessness disrupt balance so badly that useful work became impossible? Would the heart struggle without gravity's usual pull? Would muscles weaken quickly? Would vision, digestion, sleep, or judgment change in dangerous ways? These were not small curiosities. They were barriers between Earth and sustained exploration. As astronauts and cosmonauts flew longer missions, doctors and researchers gathered evidence that began to turn uncertainty into knowledge. They studied fluid shifts, motion sickness, bone and muscle loss, cardiovascular adaptation, and the subtle ways the body responds when one of its oldest environmental conditions suddenly disappears. This made space medicine a frontier within the frontier. The challenge was not only to build machines that could survive orbit, but to understand whether the people inside them could remain healthy, effective, and alive. The body itself became another unknown world the space race had to explore. Astronauts lost muscle, fluids, and orientation in ways doctors had never seen. Once humans began spending longer periods in orbit, the body revealed how deeply it depends on gravity without us ever noticing on Earth. Fluids shifted upward toward the chest and head. Faces looked puffier. Legs could appear thinner. Balance changed because the inner ear was suddenly receiving a strange new message, or almost no familiar one at all. Muscles that normally work against gravity started weakening when that constant demand disappeared. Even simple coordination could feel unfamiliar at first. For doctors and researchers, this was astonishing, because space was turning the human body into an experiment no hospital on Earth could fully reproduce. The lessons mattered immediately. If people were going to work in orbit, travel farther, or one day live for longer periods away from Earth, their bodies had to be understood as carefully as the spacecraft around them. In that sense, every astronaut carried not only instruments and ambition into space, but an entire living laboratory shaped by gravity's sudden absence. Fire in Apollo 1 exposed how deadly spaceflight remained on the ground. The great danger of the space race did not always wait in vacuum or during launch. In January of 1967, Apollo 1 showed that catastrophe could strike before a rocket ever left the pad. During a routine ground test, a fire erupted inside the sealed command module, and the cabin became a trap within seconds. The crew had no real chance to escape. That fact shocked the public because it overturned a comforting assumption. Many imagined the gravest dangers began only once a spacecraft entered the sky. Apollo 1 proved that the entire system, Every wire, material, hatch design, and atmosphere choice had to be treated as a matter of life and death from the very first moment. The disaster stripped away illusion with brutal force. Spaceflight was not yet a polished pathway to glory. It was still an unforgiving enterprise, where hidden design flaws could kill even when the mission had not truly begun. 3 Apollo 1 astronauts died during a launchpad test. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were not lost during a dramatic ascent or a fiery re-entry from space. They died during preparation, while sitting inside a spacecraft on the ground during what should have been a controlled test. That is part of what makes the tragedy so haunting. The danger arrived in a place that should have felt more manageable, more protected, and more understood. Grissom was already one of America's most experienced astronauts. White had become the first American to walk in space. Chaffee was preparing for his first mission. Together they represented skill, promise, and the future of Apollo. Their deaths struck NASA at the human core because these were not abstract losses in a technical program. They were colleagues, husbands, fathers, and friends suddenly taken by a fire so fast that training and courage could do almost nothing against it. The Moon program carried grief inside it from that day forward. Apollo 1 forced NASA to redesign spacecraft with painful urgency. After the fire, NASA could not simply mourn and continue as before. The Apollo command module had to be examined with a severity that matched the scale of the loss. Investigators identified dangerous materials, wiring concerns, hatch problems, and the risks created by a pure oxygen environment under test conditions. The redesign effort that followed was intense, expensive, and emotionally heavy because every change was being made under the shadow of 3 deaths. Yet that painful urgency may have saved later crews. Spacecraft interiors were made safer. The hatch system was improved. Flammable materials were reduced. Procedures became stricter. The lesson was harsh, but essential. In exploration, ambition without ruthless attention to detail can become fatal. Apollo 1, therefore, stands as one of the turning points of the whole space race. The path to the Moon did not continue in spite of the disaster. It continued only because the disaster forced NASA to become more careful, more honest, and more exacting than before. The space race was a contest of courage, grief, secrecy, and invention. It is tempting to remember the era only through its brightest images: rockets climbing skyward, astronauts waving, and footprints pressed into lunar dust. Yet the deeper truth is more layered and more human. The space race was driven by extraordinary bravery, but also by mourning for lives lost in tests, explosions, and hidden failures. It was powered by dazzling invention, yet shaped just as strongly by secrecy, rivalry, and fear. Engineers built machines of astonishing capability, while governments wrapped many of those efforts in propaganda and political pressure. Crews became heroes, though some stepped into danger with only a partial understanding of what awaited them. That mixture is what gives the period its lasting power. It was not a clean story of progress moving upward in a straight line. It was a turbulent age in which brilliance and tragedy traveled together. The stars drew humanity forward, but the road toward them was never smooth and never simple. Even after rivalry cooled, the technology of the space race stayed with us. When the fiercest phase of the competition faded, the machinery of the age did not simply vanish with it. Its influence remained woven into daily life, research, industry, and the way modern societies imagine technological possibility. The race had accelerated work in electronics, materials, communications, remote sensing, and systems engineering, and those advances did not retire when the political drama softened. They kept spreading outward into civilian uses, scientific missions, and the infrastructure of ordinary life. Even the organizational lessons endured. The space race taught institutions how to coordinate vast technical projects across factories, laboratories, universities, and control centers. Just as important, it left behind a cultural inheritance. People who grew up in that era carried its expectations into later decades, believing that immense problems could be tackled through focused effort, engineering skill, and public commitment. The rivalry cooled, yes, but it left the future permanently altered. The age ended. Its momentum did not. The first handshake in space came after years of bitter competition. For so long, American and Soviet missions had symbolized rivalry, suspicion, and the struggle to prove which system could claim the future. That is why the meeting in orbit during the Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975 carried such emotional weight. When astronauts and cosmonauts joined hands in space, the gesture felt larger than diplomacy alone. It suggested that the same heavens once used to measure division could also host cooperation. The handshake did not erase the history that came before it. The years of secrecy, propaganda, and competition were still real. That is part of what gave the moment its meaning. It was not innocence meeting innocence. It was former rivals choosing, however briefly and symbolically, to connect above the Earth they had long orbited in contest. The image remains powerful because it condensed an era's transformation into one human act. After so much tension, a hand reached out in weightlessness, and another hand answered. Apollo-Soyuz turned former rivals into partners in orbit. The mission itself was modest compared with the giant lunar expeditions, yet its symbolism was profound. An American Apollo spacecraft and a Soviet Soyuz capsule docked in orbit, and their crews visited one another, exchanged gifts, conducted joint activities, and demonstrated that cooperation in space was now possible between the two former adversaries. The technical side mattered too. Docking systems had to be compatible. Procedures had to be coordinated. Communication had to work across languages, habits, and engineering traditions shaped by years of separation. In that sense, the mission was both a political gesture and a practical rehearsal for a different future. Space no longer had to be only a scoreboard. It could also become common ground. That idea would grow far beyond the mission itself in later decades. Apollo-Soyuz therefore stands at a fascinating hinge in history. The race that had once driven each side apart had also built the tools that finally allowed them to meet one another among the stars. The space race ended, but its inventions never really did. Some historical periods end cleanly in memory, with a treaty, a date, or a final decisive event. The space race is stranger than that. Its most intense chapter certainly closed, but the technologies it accelerated kept evolving and multiplying in forms both dramatic and ordinary. Guidance systems improved. Satellite networks expanded. Computing shrank and spread. Techniques first sharpened for exploration found new roles in science, industry, medicine, transport, and communication. Even the idea of what a nation or a species might attempt technologically had been permanently enlarged. That is why the race feels both finished and unfinished at the same time. The flags, speeches, and Cold War urgency belong to a specific era, yet the inventions that surged forward in those years never stopped moving. They continued into the world around us, often so quietly that we forget their origin. The competition ended as a political struggle, but as a source of technological momentum, it never truly came to rest. For one extraordinary decade, humanity raced from Earth to another world. That is perhaps the most astonishing truth of all. Within little more than 10 years, human beings moved from their first fragile steps into orbit to standing on the moon. The pace feels almost unreal when laid out in sequence. One decade held first satellites, first animals in orbit, first humans in space, first spacewalks, first journeys around the moon, and the first landing on another world. So much risk, invention, failure, courage, and adaptation was compressed into a span short enough for one child to grow into a teenager, while history transformed overhead. That is why the space race still feels dreamlike, even when every detail is factual. The scale of change was immense, and it happened fast enough to leave people breathless. For a brief period, the impossible kept becoming normal almost before the world had processed the last miracle. Humanity did not just look upward in that decade. It crossed the distance and arrived. As our journey through the space race comes to a close, we can leave behind the roar of engines, the bright flare of launch pads, and the long arc of those daring missions that carried human beings farther than ever before. Tonight we have wandered through a remarkable age of history, from the first small satellite crossing the dark above Earth to the first footsteps pressed into lunar dust. We have followed astronauts and cosmonauts, engineers and dreamers, through triumph, fear, rivalry, invention, and wonder. It is such an astonishing thing to remember. In one brief stretch of human history, the sky changed. The moon was no longer only a distant light. It became a place people could reach. Strange machines crossed the silence. Small capsules carried fragile human lives into the unknown. And all the while, the blue world below kept turning, bright and solitary in the dark. Now, you can let that vast story begin to drift. Let the rockets grow distant. Let the voices from mission control fade into the background. Let the moon hang softly in your mind, pale and far away, while the day loosened its grip and your thoughts become lighter. And if you have enjoyed this slow journey through history, do consider subscribing, leaving a comment, or sharing the video with someone who might like to wander here too. And if you happen to still be awake in a moment, there will be another video waiting for you on screen, ready to carry you into another corner of the past. But for now, there is nowhere to go, and nothing more to do. Only rest, only stillness, only sleep drawing a little closer with every breath. Sleep well, and good night.